You're listening to Kate Palmer from sparkletart.com.
Today I'm going to show you how I choose to prepare to colour an image. Now I don't do this all the time, and sometimes I sort of just do it in my head rather than on paper, but in something that's a little bit larger like this, where it's a lot of face and a lot of colouring, it really pays to sort of do a bit of preparation first. I've got this wonderful image from Sweet Pea Stamps called Hemlock, and this is by Rebecca Sins, and it's part of her Beautiful Poisons range.
You'll need 2 copies of your image to complete this. One, as you can see, I've printed on my Copic blending cardstock and then cut out with a spellbinder die. And the other, which is going to be my colour map, it can be just on scrap paper, or it can also be on your Copic blending cardstock. You can see I've had to add a few little extra bits to my image just to make it fit the square shape that I've chosen.
So I'm just going to show you what I do. I call it a colour map, and this just allows me to test out how the colours will work together that I've chosen, and I also sort of draw a brief sort of guideline to myself to sort of remind me where to put the colours when I'm colouring.
To start your colour map, you need to select either the darkest colour you'll be using or the colour you'll be using to add shadows. In this case, it's BV01 for me. I'm using skin tones that I've already selected and I know work together well. Before you start your colour map, make sure that you are working on your spare image and not the one that you will be using for your final copy. Choose which direction the light's coming from and fill the face in with the shadowed areas, so where you want your colour to be darkest.
And I'm just using BV000 to indicate where there's still shade, but a little bit less.
Now the whole point of this is so that when I start colouring, I know exactly where those darkest areas need to be and where there needs to be shade, but not as much, so I can colour a little bit more freely.
This is somewhat similar to a light pattern in that you put where the shadows are going to be, but I'm now going to move on to the surrounds and test the colours for my greenery.
These will be the greens I'm playing with to create both the eye colour and some of the background. And basically what I do at this point is test them out on the image, see how they lay over the shadow colour or over the skin colour if that's what you've put down, see how they combine together. I've just found that doing it this way means that you already know what you want when you're coming to do your final image, and it means you have less mistakes as well. I've tested some of the greens for the eye and decided what I'd like. I'm now moving on to testing the greens for the background. I'd like something that creates a subtle blend of the green and the purple. To see what works best, I've tried YG11 as the green for my background and both BV000 and BV000. I can now see that the 000 is too pale and I'll have to go for BV000.
Alright, so I've got the shading on my face pretty much laid out for myself. I've done some colour tests on the side to check my background. I've tested the colour I'd like for the eyes. Next thing to do is mark out some of those darker areas on the hair. So I just have a C3, which is probably part of what I'll be using.
Now, just like the skin, I'm using the colour that I will actually be using on my image to add the shadows and the darker areas. In this case, it's C3. So I'm going over the hair and just making a note of where I want it to be darker. Around the edges, picking out a few strands, really mapping out where I want to put those darker pieces when I colour, so that when I do, I don't have to think about it, I just have to follow my plan. You can really see it starting to come together, and it really gives you a good idea about where you should go next when you're colouring. Now I'm going to try a little bit of what I had thought to use as the blush colour, but you'll see when I added over that purple, it really doesn't make a good combination. So that helps me decide against that.
So again, this is just a quick colour map to make it a little bit easier when I'm colouring. So what I do is I just sit this next to myself while I'm colouring, just to make it easier to see where I want to put those darker colours. Now, getting the levels of shade and light right was one of the most difficult things that I've found when learning how to colour with Copics. It wasn't so much the blending, it was getting that effect I was after. And this is a really good way to help you conquer those image colouring problems. So if you do a colour map first, it just gives you a really good idea of how it's going to look and what you might need to change before you start colouring your image. So I have my image that I'm going to be colouring, and I have my image map sitting next to it, which shows where I'm going to put the unusual colours, the darker colours, the shadows, that kind of thing. So I just like to work side by side, so I know I'm sort of getting it in the right area. I'm going to start by putting down a layer of E00. This is the only time I'll be using this colour because it's so pale, but it just gives you a really good base to work from.
I find that adding a base layer of a very pale colour allows subsequent layers to blend a little bit more easily. The next step is completed with E000. At this point, what I'm basically doing is remarking those darker areas onto my actual image using E000. This colour is dark enough to show up against the first layer, but light enough so that if you find something you'd like to change later, you can still colour over it with the subsequent colours I'm using.
Alright, so that's my two base layers down. Now for these I haven't really been attempting to blend in particular. They're so pale that they'll be gone over quite quickly. So you can see when I get up close that I've just faintly laid in those shadows. And that's going to make it much easier for me not to go overboard with them when I actually get to the darker colours.
I'm now ready to start adding some of the deeper colours to the face. The first layer I'm going to add is E11, which will give me a really good base for the shadows. It'll also really start to deepen up some of those shadowed areas and start giving some dimension to the face. Next I'm adding E21. I'm going directly over the top of E11. I'm not going right to the edge, so I'm adding a darker shadow in the deepest areas with the E21.
See, I'm working relatively quickly, and then I'm going back with the E000. Just over those edges. Now with those first two colours, I layered one right over the top of the other. With this E000,
I'm just going over the edges and then extending it further into the base colour. This really helps blend those colours together. My image at this point is looking quite streaky and kind of zoned. You can actually see the individual colours without much blending, but that's where it should be at this point. Now we work on blending the colours and adding the shade.
Alright, so my biggest problem is, at the moment I'm really liking it, even without any further blending, but I would like it to be a little bit darker, so onwards and upwards. I'm going to add some of the BV000, and this is just going to help with my shadows. Now you need to be quite light-handed with this, otherwise it can kind of take over.
This is actually the palest of the blue violets that I trialled on my colour map. I think the darker BV01 might be too strong. This is where the colour map comes in really handy. I don't need to think about where I'm adding this colour, I just need to follow the darkest areas on the colour map. So what was originally the BV01 is where I'll be adding this colour, which is BV000, right where the heaviest shade is. You can also see I'm using light feathery little strokes. This helps keep the colour from taking over.
Now you might notice that I'm not using a circular stroke when I apply my colour. That is fantastic when you're beginning to get a nice smooth blend, but as you have a play with them you'll realise you don't actually have to use circular blending to get a gorgeous result. Copics are incredibly forgiving that way. It's one of the things I like the most. Now I have discovered that the trick for me is to put as little ink on as possible, because I tend to be a little heavy-handed. So the secret is just to figure out what works for you and stick to it. And the only way to do that is to play. So you can listen to lots of people telling you what to do, and you can go to the classes, but in the end they're your markers. You need to figure out what works for you and how you draw. And the only way to do that is to give it a go. So have a look at how someone else is telling you to do it. Do it that way, see if it works. If it doesn't work for you, try a different way. There's no right or wrong. Okay, so even now you can see it's beginning to get a bit of that depth just by adding the purple in some of those areas. Okay, so starting again with that E11, and I'm just going to start to deepen up some of those
shadows.
Now I love using this flicking technique because for me it gets a really nice blend. But again, as I've just said, you need to figure out what's going to work for you. So give lots of different techniques a try and find what you like.
While adding this E11, I'm still following the original colour map. So this is going over those previous colours that I've laid down, and this is going to be the darkness in the image.
And then back in with the E000, just to sort of work on the edges here, taking it up into the hairline slightly, just brushing over these edges.
This really helps to blend those darker colours into the base colour.
Now you can see I'm really getting some depth to the colour now.
If you're looking for a subtle image, you would call this finished at this point, but I'm going to add one more layer of each of those colours for something really dramatic. In hindsight, I could have stopped right here and been very happy with my image, but I've decided to darken everything up by adding one more layer. Sometimes that's a fantastic decision, other times you wish you could go back in time. This actually turned out okay. It made for quite a dramatic image by the time I'd finished, but I really had to work at that last layer to get things to blend as well as they had previously. I've gone over with E11 on all of the edges, and then what I've done after that additional colour is go back over almost the whole thing with E000, just to add a bit more colour to those lighter areas and blend the image a bit better.
Now I'm just going to add some of the E11 to some glass, pick it up with the pale fruit pink, and just add it to the edges here so it gets a blend of those colours.
When the two images sit side by side, it's rather obvious I've followed my colour pattern quite closely. Now the only changes I've made are adding a slightly lighter shadow colour, so the colour I've used to create my patterning is not the same blue-violet I've used on the actual image. I've gone down a notch, and you can see how gorgeous this looks and how smooth in the finished product.
And this is how I've chosen to use my finished image, mounting it on a card. So I've got roses that coordinate along with leaves, some ribbon I've also coloured with the Copic markers, little poison bottle, I'll give you a close look at that in a second, and of course I've done the background with my Copics and paint pens.
I've created all of these embellishments with the same colour Copic markers as I've used on my image to get a wonderful coordinating piece. It's a really easy trick to make sure everything comes together.
When you get in nice and close, you can see how dramatic the colouring has turned out to be on that image. Now you could always go and have that a little softer by just leaving it at that intermediate step before I've added the additional layer of E11. You can always stop at any time, so it doesn't have to be quite as dramatic as I've made it. The Copic coloured ribbon down the bottom here. And of course that poisons bottle that I've created using an image transfer and wax. Little embellishments, and all of these have been made to coordinate and created especially. So the flowers were coloured, all the embellishments were done. You can see the background here. Getting up nice and close here, you can really see the depth of the colours on the face that I've achieved here. Now the little bit of grey down here is actually from the borders that I've done around the image. Basically C1 through to C9 to colour the edges of the image so that you get this beautiful sort of framing effect. And some of that just got on the neck here. So as you see, I didn't add that when I was colouring. So up close you can see how gorgeous those eyes look.
So I hope it's been of some use, seeing the process I use to colour more complex images, just to make a few less mistakes.
And that is my finished card using hemlock for sweet pea stamps.
Thanks so much for watching and have a wonderful day. Bye.